The boy said it the way he said most things, plainly and without weight, while he pushed a toy grater through the dirt at the edge of the gravel. He said the big dog was walking on two legs again, out past the equipment line, and he said it the same way he might have reported that the dog had been brown or that it had a long tail. He kept his hands on the lug nut he was breaking loose, and he finished the turn because the wrench had bitten, and a man let the wrench finish before he looked at anything. Then he looked. There was nothing out past the equipment line but the low scrub and the haul road bending into the pines, and the gray morning light lying flat on all of it. And he told the boy that he probably saw a man stretching, and the boy said okay. And that was the end of it for a while. Wade ran the gravel pit operation on the north end of the lease, which meant he ran the crusher, the loader, the water truck, and a scale shack with a propane heater that worked when it felt like it. He had done it for 11 years. Before that, he had set chokers on a cut-up near the divide, and before that, he had done the kind of work a younger man does, the work that teaches you which of your joints will betray you first. He was 44. He had a bad shoulder he did not talk about, and a way of measuring things by eye that was almost never wrong. By more than an inch. He could call a load to the quarter-ton off the look of it in the bucket. He could read a stockpile's face and tell you whether it would stand or slump by the way the fines had layered in it. He did not exaggerate. He had a low opinion of men who did, because a man who rounded a load up was a man who would round a danger down. And on a pit you could not afford either kind of rounding. The pit had killed a man before Wade's time, a young one who walked the toe of a wet pile, and Wade had read the report on it once and never forgot the part where the foreman said the kid was careful. Because careful was not enough. He was exact. Exact was a different thing, and it had kept him alive 11 years on a piece of ground that did not forgive. His name was Eli, and he came to the pit on the mornings. His mother worked the early shift at the clinic, which was 3 mornings a week. And on those mornings, Wade kept him close and gave him a job that was not a job, a pile of decommissioned bolts to sort by size, or a grater to push through the safe dirt near the shack. Ole took the knot job seriously. That was a thing Wade was proud of in a quiet way. The boy understood that you stayed where you were put, that you did not walk toward the equipment, that the loader had a blind side and the blind side would not see you, and that was not the loader's fault, it was yours. Eli could recite all of it. He recited it back the way some kids recited cartoon lines. So when the boy said the big dog was walking on 2 legs, Wade filed it where he filed most of what a 5-year-old said, in the soft place that did not require action. Kids saw things. They saw faces in the rock face of the high wall. They saw a wolf and a coyote. They saw their own shadow and got scared of it. He had a deer pause on the haul road that morning, a young doe that stood too long in the open before it remembered it was prey and folded itself back into the scrub. And he thought maybe the boy had seen the deer rise up on its hind legs to reach a branch, which they did, which looked strange if you had never seen it. That was a rational thing. It fit. He set it on the shelf with the other rational things, and he went back to the loader. The first thing that did not fit came 2 days later, and it came the way the real ones always came, not as a fright, but as a small, wrong detail in an ordinary morning. He found tracks in the soft material at the base of the stockpile. He found them because he was checking the toe of the pile for slump, which he did every morning. Because a stockpile that has begun to slump will bury a man who walks under it, and it will do it without a sound. The tracks were not deer. They were not bear, and he knew bear. He had measured bear before for his own curiosity, and could call the difference between a black bear's hind pad and the front without thinking. These were long. They pressed deep at what should have been the ball of a foot, and they showed 4 points ahead of the press that were not the rounded points of a paw. They were narrower than that. They dug in. He crouched and he looked at them for a while, without touching them. The light was good, low, and raking across the material, and it threw each impression into relief, so he could read the depth. He took out the folding rule he kept in his vest, and he laid it alongside the longest of them, and the impression ran past 11 inches before it closed. He did not say anything to himself about that. He just noted it, the way he noted a load weight, and he stood and he looked at the spacing between the impressions, and the spacing was the part he did not like. The spacing was long. Whatever had made them had crossed the open ground in front of the stockpile in strides that did not belong to anything that walked on 4 feet. He told himself it was a man in a costume, and he heard how stupid that was before he had finished the thought, because no man walked out to a working gravel pit in the dark in a costume to leave 11-inch tracks for nobody to find. He told himself it was a bear with a hurt leg, walking funny, and the bear story held for about as long as it took him to lay the rule against the depth a second time, because a bear that size would have left a different track entirely and would have left more of them, fanning the way a heavy animal mills around a food source. These did not mill. They came from the tree line on the east side, crossed the open ground in a straight line, paused at the stockpile, and went back the way they came. They had business. That was the wrong word, and he knew it was the wrong word, and he could not find a better one. The 11 inches looked like nothing on the little screen. The depth read as a smudge. He put the phone away and he went and got the water truck and he wet the area down before the day crew came in, and he told himself he did it to keep the dust down, which was a thing he did every morning anyway, and which was also, he understood later, the first time he hid something. He erased the tracks, and he did not know yet what he was protecting. The boy was not at the pit that day. He was glad the boy was not at the pit that day, and he did not look too hard at why he was glad. That night at the kitchen table he asked Eli, careful and easy, to tell him again about the big dog. Diane was at the stove, and she half turned at the question because she heard the careful in it before Eli did. Eli said the big dog walked on 2 legs by the trees, and it watched him sort the bolts, and then it went away. Wade asked him what color it was. Eli thought about it the way he thought about hard questions with his whole face, and he said it was the color of the burnt part of toast, and Wade had to look at his own hands for a second because that was a more useful description than anything his phone had given him. He asked Eli if the big dog had said anything, and Eli looked at him like the question was silly, and said, "Dogs don't talk, Dad." And Wade said, "No, they don't." And that was true, and it did not help. Diane caught him in the hallway after the boy was down. She did not ask if something was wrong, because she did not waste questions she already knew the answer to. She asked what he had found. He told her about the tracks, and he kept his voice flat, and he gave her the measurements because the measurements were the only part he trusted, and she listened the way she listened to everything, with her arms crossed and her weight on one hip, and when he was done, she did not tell him he was imagining it, and she did not tell him he was right. She said, "Keep Eli off the pit." He said, "It comes in the dark. The boy's only there in daylight." She said, "Keep him off the pit anyway." And he said, "Okay," and the okay landed wrong in the hallway, because they both heard that he had agreed too fast, the way a man agrees when he has already decided the same thing and does not want to admit why. The pit was a quiet place at the wrong times. In the middle of a shift, it was all noise, the crusher running its low, constant grind, the loader's backup alarm, the diesel knock of the water truck, the day crew calling to each other over it all. Wade came in before the crew, and he left after them. and in those margins the place went silent in a way that other places did not. The high wall cut the wind and gave it back as a flat, dead air that did not move the scrub. The pines on the east absorbed sound the way a heavy snow absorbs it, so that a man could call across the open ground and the call would not carry, would die 10 feet out as if it had hit a wall. There were mornings he stood in the scale shack with his coffee and heard nothing at all. Not a bird, not a truck on the county road 2 miles off. Nothing. And he had always liked that silence. He would carry the coffee to the shack window and stand there with the propane heater ticking behind him and listen for the small sounds a working landscape made on its own. The tick of cooling metal, the settle of gravel in a pile, the far whine of a saw on a neighbor's lease. The absence had a texture to it. It had a pressure, the way a room has a pressure when someone has come into it behind you and is standing very still. And he started to understand that the silence was not empty. The silence was something holding. Still, he set a trail camera. He had one from a season. He had thought about hunting, and then had not, and he zip-tied it to the leg of the conveyor frame, facing the east tree line, and he told himself he was being thorough and not afraid. The first night it gave him nothing but a raccoon, and the slow drift of fog through the frame at 4 in the morning. The second night it gave him nothing at all, which should have been a relief and was not. Because the camera was motion-triggered and the fog had moved enough the first night to trip it. And on the second night something had been still enough in front of it or far enough to the side of it that it never fired. The third night, the camera was on the ground. The zip ties were not broken. They were unthreaded, pulled back through their own ratchets, which is a thing that does not happen on its own, and is a thing that takes fingers, or something that worked like fingers, working slow. He stood with the camera in his hand for a long time that third morning. The unthreaded zip ties bothered him more than the tracks had. A track was an animal passing through. The zip ties were a decision. Something had stood at the conveyor leg in the dark and had not torn the camera down, had not smashed it, had worked the ties back out of their ratchets one at a time and set the camera on the ground facing up at the sky, and the deliberateness of it sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He checked the camera's card. The last image was from 11 minutes after he had left the night before, and it showed the tree line, and at the right edge of the tree line, low and partial and out of focus, because it was too close to the lens to focus, was a vertical shape the color of the burnt part of toast. He did not show Diane the picture. He told himself the picture was useless, too blurred to prove anything, and that was true. And it was also the second time he hid something, and he was keeping a count now without meaning to. He moved the camera. He wired it this time, ran a length of fence wire through the mount, and twisted it tight with pliers. And he set it lower and angled it along the base of the stockpile where the tracks had come. And for 2 nights it gave him the ordinary traffic of the dark, a coyote, the raccoon again, a barn owl that dropped through the frame like a thrown sheet. On the third night with the wired camera it gave him 40 seconds of the stockpile in infrared, and then it gave him a sound that the camera was never built. To render well a low compression in the audio, a bass rumble with something chattering underneath it like 2 throats working in one chest. And then the frame went to static and stayed static, and the timestamp kept running on a gray field of nothing for the rest of the card. He played those 40 seconds, more times than he would admit. He played them with the phone against his ear in the scale shack with the propane heater ticking, and each time the sound came he felt it in his back teeth before he heard it in his ear, which was not possible from a phone speaker and which happened anyway. It was not a growl the way a dog growls. A dog's growl is a single source, a single column of air. This was layered, 2 registers at once, the low one steady and the high one fast and broken, and it did not rise and fall the way an animal's warning rises and falls. It held. It was the sound of something that did not need to threaten, because threatening is for things that might still be challenged, and it had decided it would not be challenged, and the sound was just the engine of it idling while it worked. He called the county. He did it from the pit, standing in the open with the phone, and he gave the dispatcher the plain version, tracks, and a damaged camera, and an animal he could not identify on his property. He gave it to her flat. No adjectives. The measurements first, because the measurements were the only part of it that sounded like a man reporting a fact instead of a man telling a story. The dispatcher was polite and tired and asked if the animal had threatened him or his livestock, and he said he did not run livestock, and she asked if there had been any property damage exceeding a threshold he could not meet with an unthreaded zip tie, and he said no, not really, and he heard the report die in her voice before she finished taking it. He could hear her typing. Slow down. He could hear the place in the form where what he was describing did not have a field to go in. And so it went nowhere. She gave him a non-emergency number for Fish and Wildlife. He called it. He left a message describing the tracks with the measurements, the 11 inches, the stride length, the 4 narrow points ahead of the press, and he kept his voice level the whole time because he had learned by then that the level voice was the only thing that bought him a hearing, and no one called him back that day or the next. On the 3rd day he called again and got a different recording and left the same message and got the same nothing. And he understood the way you understand weather, that no one was coming. The system that was supposed to have a place for this did not have a place for this. It had a place for nuisance bears and for deer in the road and for a cougar seen near a school, and it did not have a place for an 11-inch track that walked in a straight line and worked zip ties with its fingers, and so it had no place for him. He was the whole department now. He was dispatch and wildlife and patrol and the man on the ground all at once. And the staffing was one tired man with a bad shoulder and a lever gun he did not believe in. Diane's mother kept the boy on Thursday and Friday that week, which gave Wade 2 mornings without Eli at the pit, and the relief of it was so large that it frightened him, because relief that large meant the fear had gotten bigger than he had let himself measure. He used the 2 mornings to walk the east tree line in daylight. He went in armed, the old lever gun across his chest, not because he believed the lever gun was an answer, but because a man does not walk toward a thing like that with empty hands, and he found 40 yards into the pines where the light went green and thick, a place where the thing had been bedding. The ground was pressed in a long oval, longer than a man, and the duff around it was scraped back to bare dirt, and threaded into the bark of the pine at the head of the oval, at a height well above his own head, were 3 parallel grooves in the wood, fresh, the sap still bright in them, evenly spaced too, even. The kind of even that a thing does on purpose, the way a man scores a board to mark where he will cut. He measured the height of the grooves against himself because he had nothing else to measure them against. He stood under them and reached up in his fingertips, with his arm at full stretch and his bad shoulder complaining, came to the bottom of the lowest groove. He was 6 feet even. The grooves started above 6 feet and ran up another 1.5 feet from there, which meant the thing had reached down to make them, or had made them while standing at a height that put its shoulder where a basketball rim would be, and either way, the arithmetic was the same, and the arithmetic was bad. He did not photograph the grooves. He had stopped photographing things. The phone made everything small and harmless. And these were not small, and they were not harmless. And he did not want a core, a small harmless version of them in his pocket. The bedding place told him a thing he had been refusing to assemble out of the separate pieces. It was not passing through. It had a place here. It lay up in the green light, 40 yards from where his son sorted bolts, and it had been doing so long enough to wear an oval into the ground, and the long line of tracks from the tree line to the stockpile was not a crossing, it was a patrol, the path between where it slept. He stood under the grooves, with the lever gun across his chest, and he made himself say the next part plainly in his own head, because he had been letting it stay vague, and vague was how a man got hurt. It had watched his son. The boy had not been making up a story about a big dog. The boy had been telling him, 3 mornings a week, in the only words a 5-year-old had, that something tall and the color of burnt toast had been standing at the tree line on its hind legs, watching him push a grater through the dirt, and Wade had put it on the shelf with the deer. That night he sat with Eli before bed, and he did the thing he had been afraid to do. He asked the boy to tell him everything about the big dog, and he did not steer it, and he did not correct it. Eli, warm and sleepy and unbothered, said the big dog stood by the trees, and it was tall like the basketball hoop, and it had a long nose, and its eyes did the shine like the cat's eyes did when the headlights got them, but yellow, more yellow, and it stood very still and it watched, and one time it tipped its head when Eli waved at it. Wade asked, keeping his voice in the same easy register the boy was using, whether Eli had waved at it more than once. Eli said he waved every time because it was friendly. And Wade said, easy, easy, that he did not want Eli to wave at the big dog anymore, that the big dog was a wild thing and wild things like to be left alone, and Eli said okay the way he said okay about not walking toward the loader. And Wade kissed the top of his head and turned off the light and stood in the dark hallway for a while, with his hand flat against the boy's door. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the front room with the lever gun and the porch light on, and he watched the tree line at the edge of his own property, which was 3 miles from the pit and which had never been part of this. And somewhere past 2 in the morning the dog began to bark at the back of the house and then stopped barking all at once. Not trailing off the way a dog stops when the deer moves on, but cut, the way a sound cuts when the dog has decided that being quiet is safer than being heard. Wade went to the back door. He stood with his face close to the glass and let his eyes adjust, and the yard came up gray, and the tree line beyond it came up black, and along the top edge of the black, above where the eyes of any animal that belonged there would have been, were 2 points of yellow shine, steady, not startled, set a hand's width apart, and they did not move, and they did not blink, and after a while they were simply not there, and he had not seen them go. The next morning there were tracks in the flower bed. Under the boy's window, Eli's window faced the back. The bed was wet from the soaker hose. Diane ran on a timer, and the material took an impression like a casting medium, and the impressions were the long ones with the 4 narrow points ahead of the press, and they came from the tree line to the window, and they stopped under the window, and they faced the glass, 2 of them side by side. The way a man stands when he is looking at something and has stopped walking to look at it. Wade stood in his own backyard at 6 in the morning and looked at the place where the thing had stood, and looked at his son's window above it, the curtain with the rocket ships that Diane had sewn, and he felt the cold animal certainty arrive in him, the thing that was not panic because panic was loud, and this was silent and total. The thing that put down the part of him that argued and reasoned and explained and replaced it with a single flat instruction that did not use words. He did not tell Diane about the window tracks in the morning, not because he was hiding it this time, but because she was already in the truck with the boy, late for the clinic, and the boy was singing the song he sang, and Wade stood in the driveway and watched the truck out, and then he went back and he wet the flower bed down with the hose. Die impressions were gone, and that was the count he had stopped keeping. That was, however many times now, that he had erased the evidence of a thing he could not get anyone to believe in, and he understood, standing there with the hose, that the erasing had never been about the evidence. He had been erasing it so that Diane would not stand where he was standing and look up at the rocket ship curtain and feel what he was feeling. He had been carrying it alone on purpose. That had been a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake. And he kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was to say out loud to his wife that the thing had found the house, and once it was said out loud, it would be a fact they both lived inside of. He moved Eli's room that day. He did it without a story, just carried the boy's bed and the dresser and the box of trucks into the small room on the front of the house that had been a sewing room, and when Diane came home and found the sewing room turned into a child's room, she stood in the doorway and looked at it and looked at him. The measurements, the side-by-side stance, the rocket ship curtain, all of it flat. She did not cry, and she did not argue. She went and stood in Eli's new front room for a while, and then she came out and she said one word, which was where. And he knew she meant where do we go? And he did not have an answer because the thing did not seem to be tied to the pit anymore, and it had come 3 miles to the house, and a thing that could come 3 miles could come 30. And he said he did not know, and the not knowing sat down at the table with them and stayed for dinner. The escalations after that did not announce themselves. They were small, and they were patient. And they were the worse for it. The soaker hose was cut one night cleanly, not chewed, and the cut ends were pressed flat, as if something had pinched the line shut to feel it before it severed it. He stood over the cut hose with the 2 ends in his hands, and turned them in the light, and there was no tooth in it, no ragged pull, just the flat, clean pinch of something that had wanted to know what the hose was before it decided it was nothing. The barn cat would not come off the porch rafters for 2 days, and then came down ravenous and twitching its sounds, flinching at the screen door, sitting with its back to the wall and its eyes on the yard. A length of the back fence, the welded wire panel, was bowed inward at a height of 5 feet, as if something heavy had leaned its weight against it to test what the fence would do. And the fence had held, the welds had held, and the bowing said that next time it might not bother to test. He measured the bow. He could not help it. The panel was pushed in 4 inches at the center, and the deflection ran the full width between the posts, which meant the load had not been a point, an animal's shoulder or chest. It had been spread, a forearm laid along the wire, a deliberate even pressure applied, and then released. Each of these Wade cataloged the way he cataloged a load, flatly, by measurement, writing none of it down and forgetting none of it. And each time he cataloged it, he felt the rational explanations he used to reach for thin out and fall away, the bear, the prankster, until there were no more rungs on that ladder, and he was standing on the bare ground at the bottom of it, looking up at nothing. He stopped going to the pit. He called in a back injury, which was a believable lie because the shoulder was real and the limp he could produce was real, and the foreman did not push it. He stayed at the house in the daylight, and he slept in 2-hour pieces, with the lever gun across his knees, and he kept the boy in the front room, and he kept the boy's mother told, fully told. Now no more counting, and the 3 of them moved through the days in a kind of held breath. He thought about leaving. He thought about it the way you think about a thing you have already decided you cannot do, turning it over to find the place where it became possible and not finding the place. Because where did a man like him go with a mortgage on the house and a boy in kindergarten and a wife with a job at the clinic, and what did he say when he got there, and to whom? And the thing about the system having no place for this was that the system also had no exit for it. There was no form. There was no office. There was the house and the tree line and the yellow shine that came back every 2nd or 3rd night and stood and watched and did not blink. On the 9th night, it came up onto the porch. He knew because the boards on the porch were old, and they had a particular complaint when weight came onto them at the 2nd step. A complaint he knew, the way he knew his own pulse. And at 2:40 in the morning, the second step spoke under a weight that was not his. Wade was awake. He was always awake now, at 2:40. He came up out of the chair with the lever gun, and he stood in the dark front room, 6 feet from the door, and he did not turn on the light because the light was inside and the dark was outside, and turning on the light would only show